at this point, I'd like to invite Stuart McDonald, Professor Charles Goodhart, and Professor Simonetta Longhi, and Professor Louise Haagh, I think, is joining us virtually to come and join us on the stage. Thank you. Thanks. Anyway, you are. Okay, and I'm going to move out of the way, I think, because we're going to ask our colleagues to have got about 5 minutes each to sort of introduce their sort of their views. And this is our, our stats and economics session. Where are we in the world? So, and I think I'm going to ask Stuart to kick off. Stuart, do you want to come up here, or do you want to? Up to you.
Yeah, I'll come here.
Go on.
Thanks, David. As an actuary, delighted to find out that actuaries are cool. That's my learning point for today. Delighted to be able to join ILC for your 25th anniversary, and grateful for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'm actually going to ground my comments firmly in data. Now, some of this is going to be quite familiar to some of you, but I think as the opening session for the day, really helpful to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. David's talked a lot about how the specifics of how our lives have changed and how that feels, but I'll sort of focus on how that's manifesting in hard data. So I'll start with my main professional area of focus, which is life expectancy, and hopefully this will work. So, over the last 25 years that the ILC's been in existence, we've seen an increase in life expectancy in the UK. David gave us the global figure of 5 years for men and a little under 4 years for women. Now, that's a really impressive rate of increase. During a 40-minute panel discussion, you'll gain around 8 minutes back, so use them wisely. These charts show life expectancy in the UK and its constituent nations, males on the left and females on the right. You can see from my table summarizing these projections, these are ONS projections, of course, that male life expectancy in 2022 has caught up with where females were 25 years ago. You can see that 79.5 for males in 2022, 79.5 for females in 1997. Significant inequalities remain. I'm going to talk more about inequalities in a later session, but for now you can see the gap between Scotland, in green there on the right, and the other UK nations. The rate of increase in life expectancy has slowed significantly over the last decade. Now, to an extent that had been anticipated, as cardiovascular death rates couldn't really continue to reduce at the rate that they had, but the slowdown we saw in the UK was more sudden than expected, and it's led to an increased gap between us and comparable countries. So it's generally believed that austerity measures have played a role here. So these charts are from the ONS population projections to 30th of June 2020. So they only include some of the pandemic impact, and they also predate the 2021 census. Both of those factors mean that the recovery from 2020 might actually be a bit slower than is shown here, and the life expectancy a little lower. But still, they give us the last formal projection of life expectancy from the ONS. And you can see here that over the next 25 years, life expectancy is expected to increase by almost 3 years for males and a bit more than 2 years for females. So slower progress than we saw over the last 25 years, expected over the next. And actually, I would expect this to be revised down somewhat next time ONS release a projection. We shall see. I really love the information on this next slide. It condenses so much into one image. The different lines are showing us the progress in life expectancy for each age attained. Over a very long time frame, you can see, as David mentioned earlier, that much of the progress in life expectancy at birth is explained by improvements to death rates, falls in death rates from infants and children. But actually, on the right-hand side, over the ILC's 25-year history, we can see really significant improvements in life expectancy at older ages too. Life expectancy at age 60 increased by 4 years for males and 3 years for females. Now, that's a really big increase in the cost of providing pensions. But arguably, life expectancy isn't the biggest story these days, demographically speaking. Birth rates are. Now, these charts are showing total fertility rate, essentially the average number of children that would be born to a woman over her lifetime if current rates at each age applied. Like life expectancy, this is just a summary statistic, but it does give us a useful view of how things are changing. First and foremost, we are well below replacement rate, which is a bit more than 2 children per woman. There's been very significant variation, as you can see in the chart on the left, in the total fertility rate during the ILC's 25-year history, rising for around a decade from the early 2000s and then falling back again. And there's very significant variation between the UK nations. Fertility is highest in Northern Ireland and lowest by some way in Scotland. Again, the projections allow us to see the ONS's view on what will happen over the next 25 years. But I would highlight just how much that view has shifted between successive projections. On the left here, you can see the projections in 14, 16, 18, and 20. Fertility trends are very hard to predict. So, what happens when we combine fertility rates, death rates, and migration? In the interest of time, I'm not going to speak about migration today. It allows us to project forward the population structure and see how things are expected to change. Again, I'm going to draw on the ONS's population projections. The chart on the left is where we are now, and the one on the right is where we expect to be in 25 years' time. The borders show the change versus today. Now, 25 years ago, we called these population pyramids, but the pyramid shape is long gone, and it's even starting to invert, with smaller, younger generations coming through. You can see at the top right, the population is expected to keep growing over the next 25 years, reaching 71 million. And actually after that, it's expected to start to decline around a decade later, but it flattens for a while at around 71 million. So that's what the data shows. Lastly, what do I think is the biggest challenge ahead? So I would argue that meeting the costs of health and social care for our aging population in a way that doesn't place too large a financial burden on younger generations is the big challenge. The best time to grapple that problem was decades ago, and the next best time is now.
Pass to Professor Goodhart, and can I remind you to ask some questions on Slido for the Q&A after?
Thank you very much. Let me start by making an apology on behalf of my profession. As macroeconomists, we tend to concentrate far too much just on our own country. We live in a wider world, and what happens in that world is much more important. We also tend to focus much more on demand, particularly monetary and fiscal policy, and we also tend to focus entirely on the very short term, what's likely to happen in the next year or two. Instead, I want to do the opposite. I want to focus much more on the wider world and look at longer-term trends, and we can look at the supply side. And I'm going to focus primarily on China. The reason I'm going to focus on China is partly because it's the most populous country in the world. What happens in China is enormously important to the rest of the world. Partly because what has happened to its demography is more extreme than in almost any other country, and partly because they are in a crisis, demographic crisis, and they know it. The top left-hand corner shows what the population charts looked like in 1970. There you see the sort of the pyramid structure, masses of children, very few old. Then, of course, you shortly got the one-child policy, which reinforced the decline in birth rates, which have occurred pretty much worldwide, except in Africa now. And that led to the top right-hand corner, demographically extraordinarily favorable for growth, with a huge increase in the working age population resulting from the high birth rates in the past, but with the birth rates going down, far fewer children to be looked after, and not very much growing in the old. Then we turn to the present, and what again you see is the bulge in the population is going up. Number of children is going down even further, but the ratio between the working age population and the old and the young is beginning to worsen. The dependency ratio is just beginning to rise. Then in 25 years' time, in 2050, the overall population will be a great deal older. It almost looks like a coffin. A great deal older. Many fewer young, and many fewer, very many fewer of the working age population relative to the old, who will be massive numbers of old, and the relative young. Now, how are they going to cope with that kind of condition, which are far fewer workers to support many, many, particularly the old? And the old are much more expensive than the young, not because they're old. I'm now demographically among the old, and I don't buy more clothes, I don't buy more food, and I go on less holidays because I don't like flying any longer. The reason why the old are so expensive is because not of dependency as such, but medical dependency. It's the inability to undertake the normal activities of daily living. It's the fact that the old are suffering from the neurological diseases, dementia, Parkinson's, which don't kill you, at least not very quickly. You hang on, and you need an enormous amount of care. 20% of a declining Japanese workforce is going to be utilized to look after the old. And the dependency ratios are going up. The red line, A, stands for the advanced economies, where the dependency ratio is going up like crazy. The blue is the world. The improvement in dependency ratios, decline in the number of the young, is now tailing off and will begin to rise as the old are increasing. And we're just going to have, you can see on the right the Japanese, the Germans. The UK and the US are protected to some extent by immigration, and the yellow dash, the Chinese. Now, all this is going to be fiscally very difficult because most of the taxation falls on the young and on capital income and profits tax. And with the old, particularly the medically dependent old, for which medicine has not done as well as with cardiovascular and cancer, anything like, we're going to have a massive increase in public sector expenditure to look after the old in the way we expect. The top line, so the two on top and the left, show the expenditure on Medicaid, pensions, and other expenditures for the old, and this is the USA. And it's growing and growing and growing, and it will for the UK as well. The bottom shows the Congressional Budget Office projection for the deficit and public sector debt of the United States, and this is taken from 2019, before COVID. And what I want to emphasize here is that the fiscal problems of fewer young to produce and pay taxes, more old, and the problem that is going to cause for taxation, which Stuart was talking about, is going to be absolutely intense. And the question of how we deal with that, again, politicians who focus solely on the next two years, or if they're forced 5 years through the OBR, haven't really begun to deal with at all. It's going to be a fiscal problem. Society hasn't yet got anything like ready to deal with that problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to pass over to Professor Longhi. I should say both Simonetta and Stuart are both members of ILC's sort of expert group. So we're very, very grateful for their support throughout the year. So Simonetta.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So, okay. So the way I've been thinking about this is in terms of inequality. This is, a topic I'm passionate about. And in terms of how the expansion of higher education, which we always talk about, might have an impact on older people. Oh, yeah, so. Okay, so here, what I have done is I have taken the labor force survey for 1997 and 2022, and I simply computed the proportion among the population of people who have a degree. So the first pale bar is the proportion of people aged 16-64, roughly working age, who had a degree in 1997, and the darker bar is that of people aged 65 plus. And at that time, less than 15% of these two groups had a university degree. Fast forward 25 years, today in 2022, among the working age population, and that's the second pale bar, the proportion of those who have a university degree has gone up to almost 40%. If we look at those who are 65 plus today, the proportion of those who have a degree is almost 25%. And if we look at the population who are aged, I have it here, 45 to 60, those are those who will be retired roughly in 25 years' time. It will be old later on. The proportion of those with a university degree is almost 35%. So if you just focus on the darker bar, you can see that the proportion of people who have a higher education over time is increasing among the older population. Why do I think this is important? Roughly speaking, we can equate having a university degree with having better job, which pay higher wages throughout your life, have better working condition often, and insofar as you have higher wage, you might also have better health, at least because you can afford to eat healthily, right? One thing that is happening is when we think about state pension age, we're going to have to wait longer and longer before we get it. Most likely it's not going to be that high in the future. But next to that, we have many more occupational pensions. So many more people are paying into their into their pension also via their employers. However, what happens is that if those people who have a university degree have higher paying job, they're going to pay more into their occupational pension. Their employer is going to pay more into their occupational pension. These people are also more likely to be employed throughout their life. So at the end of their working career, they might end up with a much bigger pot than those people who don't have a university degree, who have jobs that don't pay that much. Therefore, they don't pay so much into their occupational pension. Their employer doesn't pay as much either. And some of these people who might be in very low wage job might decide actually to opt out, so end up with actually with no occupational pension later on in their life. And I think this is important because as long as the group of those who have a higher education is relatively small, we might just try to take care of the population as a whole. But once we have two sizable groups, one which is relatively well off and one which is not well off, we need to start thinking of changing the way we deal with these two groups of the population. Another thing that got me thinking was COVID and the fact that for some people it has changed priorities, right? So maybe work is not that much important anymore. Family becomes more important, free time, I don't want to just work all my life and then die before getting to retire. So what happens is that some people, even if they are in good health, they might decide to retire early because they can afford it, while those other people who perhaps don't have a university degree and don't have a very good job will have to be working until they reach state pensions to be able to make ends meet. So this is really what I wanted to talk about. Do we need to rethink the system and take into account that there might be quite big differences across this group of people? I have a next slide that I'm not really going to talk about so much right now because I don't think I have that much time. But we often talk about inequalities in terms of men versus women, white versus non-white, and if we look at how things have changed in terms of proportion of people who have a degree, we have now more women, slightly more women get a university degree in proportional terms than men, and also non-white are more likely to have a university degree. So different types of inequality that might, interact with each other, and I think it's probably worth taking into account when we design the system. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think finally we have, we should have Professor Haagh joining us online. Is that right? And yep, great. Hi, Louise. Louise has been doing some amazingly interesting work around universal basic income, and I think this is a bit about what she's going to talk about. So, Louise, we can see you. Can we hear you?
I hope so.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. So, do kick us off, Louise.
Okay. So, well, thank you for inviting me to talk about long-term challenges for the British welfare state. I think all too often we get caught up in the short-term fiscal trade-offs when what we really need is a systemic picture of economic security over the life course, and how, of course, that feeds into the process, the aging process, security in old age as well. So I'm going to kick off by first emphasizing some of the macro framing trends that encase the problem, as it were, that I'm going to talk about, which is the design of social protection. So what we see, first of all, is Britain's tax challenge, as I call it. We're all aware of this, of course. Britain's tax level is low. The burden of state spending is quite high, which is not efficacious. The tax level in Britain has not been raised significantly since the 1970s, whereas our major competitors in terms of welfare state design have had significant increases in taxation. So this presents, I think, a long-term problem in terms of what I'm going to say. And at the same time, I think Britain's welfare state is to a larger extent than our competitors, again, exposed to rising private sector costs, such as in housing, to give one example, which comes into view if you look at the slim light yellow band in the middle of the figures that I present on this slide. You can see that housing costs in Britain is much higher than in other countries, so spending is less efficacious. And then on the other hand, if you focus on the bottom of the figure, on the blue bar to the right, on the blue bar, sorry, which is active labour market policy spending, Britain spends comparably much less, and less over time as well, compared with other countries. So I think that there is a fiscal challenge in terms of the ability to spend, but also in terms of what Britain spends on its money on. And I think this presents then institutional challenges as well as opportunities for reform. And what I want to focus on today really is how improving social protection design is linked with other challenges that involve enhancing occupational investment and stability in the economy, along with rethinking design of social protection access and funding for working age adults. And I think it's well known in the literature that Britain lags behind other European countries, other advanced welfare states in terms of spending on economic security for working age adults. So I first want to stress that the evidence that we have, sorry, let's change this slide here. The evidence that we have that more stable economic security over the life course improves motivation and health is quite overwhelming. And some of this evidence was incorporated in a report I did for the WHO in 2019, and formed part of the evidence which was presented at the inauguration of a new department in the WHO in 2019 on social determinants of health. And I think the key here is just to highlight the recognition that now exists at the global level of how social security design impacts health. So not just the amount of spending, but how we design economic security through the life course. And findings that uncertainty about a person's status and access to income security is paramount. It has adverse health impacts, which has been recognized, for example, by the National Audit Office in the UK, and its reports on sanction systems in the UK. I think this sort of evidence leaves pause for reflection about what improvements that can be made to the design, to the access of economic security for working age adults. And I think on this basis, there has been in the UK talk about the merits or demerits of a more simple form of access to income security, or a proportional universal floor, which incorporates at least some of the elements of a universal basic income, which is defined by the features on this slide that I'm showing you here. And we have had proposals in the UK also listed on this slide more recently that incorporate many of these features of universal basic income, and we can talk more about that. But I think, as I said at the beginning, besides the question of the status of access, there are also wider issues of funding and labor market issues that feed into this. So among long-term design deficits in income security in Britain, I think from a life course perspective, there are three. First of all, our economic security system for working age adults does not cater to all groups, partly because there's no effective unemployment insurance in terms of a wage-linked component. And the system is heavily reliant, therefore, on central tax finance, which if I compare with the situation in Denmark, for example, where about 2/3 of income support coverage is tied to the contributory wage-linked system, which is subsidized by the state, but to about 1/3 of the cost. But this input from contribution and the higher wage-linked coverage has several advantages. It relieves short-term fiscal pressures on the state. This is, of course, important for Britain. And it also improves the quality and the skills component of employment transitions, because with the wage-linked cover, people have longer time to look for the right type of employment. But in relation to this, a third deficit, I think, of the British system is, as it stands, that it's not effectively aligned with education or occupational planning and mediation. So these slides here shows investment in employment transitions. And we can see that the UK historically has spent less on training relative to administration compared with other OECD countries. And in Denmark, it's the reverse. So there is certainly a design and a spending challenge there, I think, that needs to be looked at. Now, if we're then going to think about what kind of social protection we would like, is sort of blue sky thinking, I think it comes back to the question, or one of the questions is how to motivate co-savings in social protection along with building a more universal floor. And this co-savings, whether that is unemployment insurance, whether it's care services or pensions, I think is a long-term challenge for Britain. And it needs state incentives. It's not, co-savings are not going to come about without state support and state subsidy. So I think what we want to aim at is something even more ambitious than what Copey and Palmer's suggested back in 1998 when they wrote their paper, and the diamonds on the slides from that paper, or at least some of them, and which was, in their view, what we need is an encompassing social protection model, a little bit like the Nordic, and you can see that in sort of aubergine-colored diamond. And I think we need something a bit more ambitious, based in guarantees, basic guarantees and income security, as well as co-funding mechanisms to consolidate a sort of multifactorial income security, more sustainable income security system in Britain over the life course. And incidentally also, which I think is very important for societal ownership of social protection in the UK, which has been very heavily state administered and very subject to political cycles. So that's another, I think, very important challenge for Britain, is how to build those more inclusive institutions of funding, of access, with better coverage. And so last, in terms of recommendations, I think there are really three pathways to life course economic security that Britain needs to look at. The first one is to consolidate a minimum income security structure that is less unconditional, that removes some of the administrative barriers to work, the incentives to work that now exist, and the adverse health outcomes that exist in the current system. Second one, to build a lifelong contributory layer of top-up, not just to cover the middle class or those with higher earnings, but somehow incorporating more social groups. And third is making trend setting, at least public occupations, more occupational. I haven't had time to talk about that, but I think we know there are big inefficiencies in in the health sector, for example, in terms of lack of funding for core occupations, and then that generates cost inefficiencies in terms of reliance on agency staff, and it also, I think, has led to a de-skilling on the other side within the healthcare system. And all of these trends, de-skilling, segmentation, and so on, they present labour market challenges that also need to be addressed in order to address effectively these issues of design and income protection that I've emphasized. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. And I know some of the themes that you've mentioned are themes that are going to come on throughout the day, including particularly that we've got a session later on around de-skilling. We've got lots of questions on here, and I am going to, I think Serene could stay for a little bit, 10 minutes longer if we go let the panel have a couple of questions. Is that okay? Yep. Okay. So we'll we may run over a little bit, but I'm really keen we don't miss the opportunity to ask a couple of questions. So we have lots on here, and let's start off with something Stuart touched on. And feel free to shout. And actually, it would be good to have Louise on the screen in case she wants to come in. The austerity. So do we think future austerity might have an impact on life expectancy going forward? Stuart, do you want to sort of kick off with that?
Is this microphone on?
It was. Try it again.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, great.
I think so.
The difficulty with measuring these things is we never have a counterfactual. So we will never be able to look back and rerun things with and without austerity. So we are likely to experience a period of future austerity, but we are also living in the shadow of a pandemic, which is going to have long-term implications on life and health. I'm not talking necessarily just about direct consequences, long COVID and other post-viral complications, but I'm talking about the impact on the health system, for example, which even if we were to suddenly move away from an austerity mindset and start pouring funds in would take a while to be able to build up the necessary redundancy and capacity in the system. We've made choices over many years to run the system hot and without capacity, so it would take a long time to unwind that with, even without austerity. So it will be hard to measure, but inevitably, one truism as relates to health and social care is if you put more in, you get more of an impact. So if we go through a period of austerity, it will have a negative impact, would be my view.
Great, thanks. I'm going to pick on Professor Goodhart in terms of, so there's a few questions here about sort of China's demography and the extent to which the one-child policy was entirely or partly to blame, or is it a global trend, and how do you see things going forward?
Well, it exaggerated the global trend quite considerably. When I talk to my Chinese friends, which I do quite a lot, they say that in the immediate future, what they're going to have to do is raise the retirement age quite considerably. It's still very low. Oddly enough, nobody has raised the question of retirement age yet. In China, the retirement age for men is 60. The retirement age for women is between 50 and 55. And for the next sort of 10 years, they're going to try and raise participation rates by shifting up the retirement age. But it's going to be politically very difficult. And President Xi, in his sort of State of the Nation presentation, said nothing at all about it. And you can't just change a retirement age overnight, because people have plans for the future. And they ought to be making steps now to raise their retirement age. The politicians haven't yet actually been prepared to do that. When I talk to the young, I tell them all, you will have to work until you're 70. And that's both men and women.
Great. No, I think, and China is just introducing planning to introduce a private pension, but also actually already has a private social care product, which is quite interesting. Louise, there's a couple of questions, if you can hear us remotely, around sort of the relationship between universal basic income and encouraging sort of inactivity, and the sort of, firstly, whether it be politically acceptable in the UK, but then secondly, actually, how do you overcome those sorts of challenges?
Well, that's obviously an old chestnut that always is brought in. But I think we need to look, first of all, at the features of the current income support systems that we have, which are demotivating. Partly because, for example, of the high taper rate when people start earning more, and also because of the policing and the different statuses that people enter into depending on how many hours they work. And it creates, I think, the wrong idea about work. The work is something that needs to be motivated by the state or enforced by the state. But actually, the reality is, from the many surveys that we have, is that people do want to work, but they face a range of administrative and labor market barriers. And I think one of the things that basic income does address, and we have to recognize that basic income will not be sufficient in the UK in terms of the current fiscal scenario. I showed you a slide before in terms of costed proposals that suggest that what we can afford is £50 a week for anyone earning less than 125,000. But nevertheless, the argument for that kind of design change is that when people have at least something that's not going to be clawed back when they start earning, that's actually demotivating. That's actually motivating because it means that anything you earn over that is your earning, and there won't be the same taper rate. Of course, that depends also on how you set tax rates, and that needs to be thought about in terms of how much you earn on the first pound or how much you earn on the first £1,000 a month. And so you may still need to have an incentivizing sort of progressive tax scale. But nevertheless, at the moment, we are in a situation in which people live in fear of losing absolutely everything, their whole entitlement to income security for a period or very long period, so for anything from 3 months to 3 years. And the reasons for that can be quite spurious. And so we live, they can be where you failed to attend an interview, or you can even be related to how you were dismissed in your previous job. So, we live in a system in which individuals are tightly controlled by state policy, and we really need to reverse that, to move towards a system that motivates and sends the right signals. And that's more enjoined with the evidence that we have that people are motivated to earn and people are motivated to work and become integrated into the labor market. But of course, we also have the challenges of the health system now, which I think we know that so many people have withdrawn. We're talking about needing people to work longer, and with the withdrawal rates we're now seeing in the labor market are of the over 50s. And much of this is to do with health, but also to do with the way that health plays into income security status and being able to access or not access benefits. And that doesn't help, I think, to motivate people to re-enter the labor market when they have to renegotiate their status constantly. So we need to look at different designs that are more motivating and that give people something that is guaranteed at the lower end. I would prefer more universally, but at least starting with means testing the rich, as it were. So not including the rich, but at least including the wider middle class and everyone below that.
Great, thanks. And of course, back in 1997, Gordon Brown talked about progressive universalism, which was how we ended up with pension credit, which is quite interesting. Simonetta, there's a few questions here around one around, how does having more people having a degree, why would we see that as being negative, or whether you can adapt a bit more on that, but also is there not a productivity gain potentially from this? Do you want to sort of grab those?
Yeah, it's working. So the way I was thinking it is in terms of inequality between groups, right? So the idea is that at the moment, those people who have a university degree and have kind of the means to have a good retirement, if you want to, is 15%. So there's a large group of people that, are all in the same situation. So as once you see an increase in the group of people who have university degree and can have, a good retirement versus a large group who doesn't, I guess this is what I was trying to say, that this creates inequality, and maybe we need to rethink that possibly like the pension system doesn't fit all to some extent, and maybe those who have a much better income later in life might be able to retire early, which consequences on who pays into the system and not. Great. Does anyone else want to come in on that? No? Yeah.
Actually, afraid to say I totally disagree with Simonetta. The increase in the number of people going to university will increase the supply of highly skilled jobs, of highly skilled workers. It will therefore inevitably tend to reduce their relative income. While the ending of the shift of workers to China and all the rest of it is going to mean we're going to have a shortage, particularly a shortage of the low-skilled. The rise within country inequality, which has been enormous and very detrimental over the past 30 years, is now going to reverse. There are going to be far fewer low-skilled people, and they will get a far higher relative wage over the next 30 years than in the past. And the people who have large human skills, because there are going to be more of them, will get less. So inequality over the next 30 years is going to go down. It's one of the few really bright spots in the picture, the demographic and geopolitical picture, that within country inequality is now going on the way down.
Great. I think at that point I'm going to stop and thank all of our speakers and their contributors for this session. Really, really grateful, and thank you so much for all the questions. There are lots and lots on here. Please do keep asking questions, and remember as well you can upvote some of the other questions so I can see them, and perhaps some of our panel might want to have a look at them and as well after. But some fascinating ones, including one relevant to our next speaker, which says that the ONS data is unduly pessimistic about the future. So we'll see whether or not Sir Ian Diamond thinks about that. And I should say, so thank you very much for joining us. Please do keep using Slido and mentioning any thoughts on Twitter. I should say, ONS, ILC are really, really delighted to work with, and we've worked with them for a very, very long time. As a global organisation, and we have 16 ILCs across the world, one of the things that's really striking, even in the ILC countries, which are mainly in the wealthier countries, everyone's jealous of the data we have. You know, I see we've got Ken here who's sort of really interested in the work you're doing with the Titchfield Group on access to data in some of the low and middle income countries. And, you know, clearly we are in a really lucky place with having ONS, and I'm just going to stop there and not ramble and let Sir Ian kick us off. That's right.
Thank you very much. Thanks, it's an enormous pleasure to be here. And look, come on, statistics and pessimism, that seems to me like a correlation close to one. So I'll take it. Look, I'm just going to try and go at a bit of a gallop through some things and talk around some of the things that we've already heard, and particularly from Stuart, who it gives me a great opportunity to thank for all his help over the last couple of years. We've worked quite closely together on a number of things. Now, look, we've seen these kind of pyramids, or whatever you want to call them, Charles. I'm not quite yet a coffin, but getting there. We've seen these before. This is for the UK from 1951, 2011, 2021 from the most recent census. I've got to say that the most recent census, the best census ever conducted in the UK, bar none. How about that? Isn't that fantastic? Well, I think there was I think the 1796 census of Corfe Castle was particularly good. But apart from that, anyway, we push on. What do we see? We see an aging society. A couple of points I just wanted to make. If you look at the left-hand one, you can see those big numbers coming out. 1947, baby boom, almost, apart from 1965, probably the biggest number of births we've ever had. First point. Second point, if you follow those two bits sticking out right at the bottom, you go over to the right in 2021, they're sticking out, frankly, 70 years further on. They've got old. And the point I just wanted to make is that something like a baby boom, or indeed a baby pullback, as Stuart talked about, lasts a very long time. Not only does it last a very long time, but one of the reasons that things go in and out is, of course, because when people become of childbearing age, they make babies. And so you see booms and busts going on. It's incredibly important to dig that out as we go on. And thirdly, the size of those pyramids has got a bit bigger. That is, as Charles said, migration playing a role. While this conference has been going on, we've announced the largest net in migration in the year to June 22. that we've had since the Second World War in this country, the largest net in migration, which I'll return to a little bit later. So we are getting older, no question, but where are we getting older? And it's a comparison for 2021 of, on the left, where people aged over 65 are, so that's 65 and over 85, but on the right, just for the over 85s. Just wanted to pick a couple of points out. The darker, the more old people there are. And if you look at the right one, first of all, what you see is for the over 85s, the south coast, and then really interestingly, well, I thought this was interesting for a long time, the English and Welsh border. And what that is, because traditionally, when we still used to go on holiday to the West Country and the South Coast, people then retired there. So that people were in about 1991, very, very full of old people who'd retired there. And people said, I don't want to retire to a place full of old people. And they started migrating. We saw it first in the 1991 census, migrations increasingly to the English-Welsh border, and also you can see for the over 85s to the Southern Lake District. The point I would make is that if you then come to the over 65s, you'll see, well, the English-Welsh border is probably a bit full of old people now, so we'll go a bit west. And the mid-Wales is where they're going. The point I'm just going to make very quickly, because I could talk for hours about this really easily, is that these are the kinds of places that are going to be needing services in 20 years' time. You know, so we know now what something about services. We also know that old people tend to, for all obvious reasons that I won't go on about, to live alone. And one of the things, this is for 2001 through to 2020, the proportions of people living alone. Now, one thing that Stuart said may well change this a little, because with the much higher levels of expectation of life for women than men historically, and mortality rates by age always being lower for women than for men, the net result of that, as you get older, and particularly through widowhood, is that you get more women who are living alone than men. That may even up a little bit as Stuart pointed out, although that differential is still there, the differential has been getting lower. But there's another slide that I won't show, but it's worth thinking about, and that is we are going through the highest cohort of single childless women we have ever had. And in another piece we have shown that by, well, when I first showed it by 2028, but now I tend to show it a little later. The number of single childless women aged over 85 will continue to increase. It's a passing point, but it relates to the fact that care is often provided, and I'll come back to care in a moment, but care is often provided by children. So there is going to be, in some of these areas where people are retiring to, not only a large number of very old people who perhaps need support, but a very large number of very old people who perhaps need support and do not have some of the traditional methods of care to support them. So that really comes down to some of the points that people have been talking about. Okay, so health. Let me talk about health. I just wanted to show you this. This is not about old people. This is from something that at ONS we call the health index. It is a function of health, healthy people, how health is for individuals, what kind of environment they're living in, healthy places, and some general stuff. Now, the point I wanted to make, that 2015 is on the left, 2020 at the heart of the pandemic, you see the orange areas around a crescent from Liverpool across to the northwest and down. And that is caused in 2020 by an increase, obviously, in ill health due to COVID, while at the same time, it's not as bad as you think, because healthy places had increased because during lockdowns, environmental, if you like, pollution reduced for all kinds of obvious reasons. The only point I would make about the right-hand side, though, is that if I showed you a graph of infant mortality in the late 19th century, it would look pretty similar. In other words, there are areas of our country which have had low health for a very, very long time, and they continue relatively to do so. And the point about health inequalities, when we actually think about expectations of life, and people have mentioned that already, but if you take a place like Aberdeen, and you take expectation of life, this is in about 2013, 2014, between the lowest ward in terms of expectation of life, lowest electoral ward, and the highest electoral ward, that difference was 16 years, 1/6. So as well as seeing some of the changes that Stuart rightly pointed out, the differences between areas are really important to pick up. I just wanted to show, though, that when we think about healthy life expectancy, because in terms of all the kinds of things that Charles was arguing, we're going to work till we're 110 or something, that we need to think about is how long is healthy life expectancy. And if you're 65, that healthy life expectancy is 11 for women and 10 for men. So it's actually quite close together for men and for women. And what this graph shows is that, particularly for women, which is the lighter blue, just in the last decade, effectively, there has been pretty big increases for women in healthy expectation of life, approaching a year in a decade, which has got to be good news. And it's really, really important. Having said that, healthy life expectancy at birth went down. And that is about some of the arguments around about lifestyles that we think about. I just wanted to say this, which at one level is pretty good news. And this is from some of our big surveys, which is about personal well-being. So it's Q2 in 2022. So this is, the summer's coming on. So perhaps there is a kind of, a bit of sun outside. You feel a bit better. But this is self-reported well-being. Green is my life is worthwhile. Blue is I'm really happy, Richard Layard's stuff. And black is I'm satisfied generally with my life. And I think a couple of points here, but what you really see is that it is people in the 60s and early 70s who are the most likely to say life is worthwhile, who are the most likely to say that their life is satisfying. I'm not entirely clear what's going on with the over 90s. Maybe it all kind of falls apart. But so what we'll do, we're going to do some qualitative work now to just go and talk to people, because I think you have to do it this time. So my point being, we have increases a little in healthy life expectancy at older ages. We have, at people at older ages, a general feeling of relatively high happiness and indeed that life is worthwhile. But what about the labour market? It's been mentioned a couple of times. What this graph shows is not activity, but inactivity. Really, really important. Inactivity, and it is over the period of the pandemic. So on the left-hand side, you've got the beginning of the beginning of July to September 2019, running through to September, a couple of months ago. And we get this from surveys and from weekly runs of different data. The point I want to make very, very clearly is A, inactivity has increased, and B, it's increased, you can see pretty clearly, in that orange group, in that orange bar, and that's people aged 50 to 64. And we first observed this towards the end of the last calendar year. We put a lot of work in the early time. The government asked us to do, I I thought very wisely, some surveys of it, and I'll show you some of the results of this, but effectively around about 500,000 extra extra people aged 50 to 64 who are now inactive. And why are they inactive? Okay, some people, yes, are retiring, particularly the case of the older ones, so I don't think that's surprising. But a lot of people are saying stress or illness or mental ill health, and also looking after caring responsibilities. We've done a number of these surveys. We could go on, but the whole group of people who are what we call sandwich carers. So they're in their 50s and early 60s. They've still maybe got an aging parent, and there may be a grandparent, or indeed they may still have children. That group are saying, well, actually, I can't, you know, I need more flexibility. One of the things they say to us, I would go back into the labour force if the labour force was more flexible. But if you think about that, right, 500,000 people, if you're prepared to take, I mean, Charles, if you allow me to, take a really rough estimate of 0.1 of a GDP for 100,000 people in the labour force, take 500,000 people out, you know, then effectively, you know, you really have an impact on GDP. And then we're in the margins around whether you are or whether you are not in recession. There's some good news, you know. I'm over 50. I'm in the labour force. I wake up every day. And anyone who's over 50 in the labour force, just think, every day you get up. Over the course of this year, I am adding 0.501 to GDP. Yo, isn't that a really great reason to get up? Oh, fantastic. So really, I think, but I mean, there's a lot of work at the moment about how do we encourage the over 50s back into the labour force. There are so many skills there, so much to contribute, but equally, employers maybe need to think about flexibility and all kinds of other things. Just to say a few words, long-term illness, though, is one of the reasons I mentioned that has been going up. And if you look on the right-hand side there, this is the number of people over the course of the pandemic who are reporting inactivity due to long-term sickness, and you can see for the 50 to 64s, that's the green at the right-hand side, there has been a steady increase. What are they sick with? I mean, sadly, as a statistician, I love that box which says other. So I've got to tell you, the biggest increase is other, which of course is a multitude of things. The problems connected with the back or neck are pretty big, and also challenges around mental ill health have gone up in that green group, age 50 to 64. I'm finishing with a few extra words, if I may, on the pandemic. I apologise, the next slide does really look like a plate of spaghetti, but there's a lot of stuff in there. I want you to concentrate here. This is from a survey that we do. If anyone has been part of a survey where we test you regularly for positivity, and it is the source of measures of COVID for our country. And thank you so much if you do, because we have been able to do this, and the government has made so much use of it, as have so many other people. So these are levels of positivity across the period since February 21. The group I'm really interested in here is the orange one, which is the over 70s, and in the main, for all kinds of reasons, to do largely with lockdowns and holdbacks and vaccination, the numbers relatively flat for the over 70s, but they increased a little bit more recently. The light blues are children, and one of the reasons that the light blues are much lower in recent months than anyone else is because we estimate that almost 98–99% of people between, if you like, 12 and 25 have either got illness-induced immunity, because Omicron is quite good at that, or they've been vaccinated, and that helps for that immunity. So that's why the numbers in the last wave didn't go up so much. But, you know, so there has been a lot of illness, but critically and very sadly, the elderly, and I don't say this is a surprise to you, the elderly have been the most impacted. 30 times greater probability of mortality for the over 80s than the over 50s. And you know, that is, I think, a really sad statistic. And then it also leads to the real push for vaccinations. And one of the things I think that is important, and that is that, as with all inequalities in health, those in the least deprived quintiles have been the most likely to get vaccinated. Those in the most deprived quintiles have been the least likely. And then that impacts both on the challenges of positivity and the challenges of subsequent mortality. And finally, just on long COVID, which is, we estimate, okay, it's self-reported, but we estimate around about 2.1 million people in our country with long COVID on the 1st of October this year. And we produce monthly estimates of that. And of those 2.1 million people, if you look at the light blue is women again, dark blue men, of those, 1 million people are over the age of 50. There is, I think, some reasons why it's a bit lower in the very old, potentially due to vaccination, potentially due to all kinds of other issues. But I think it is important because we don't know the long-term impact of long COVID in a long time. As Stuart rightly said, when he said, well, we don't have a counterfactual on a recession, although Stuart helped us a lot on some predictions that we have made, which you make these predictions, don't you, in 2020, and you're thinking, gosh, this is really clever stuff. And then in 2023, you're thinking, oh my God, let's just see how we did, you know, as we will be doing the same with long COVID. I think it's going to be one of those things where we will just have to really tirelessly monitor. So look, that's a run through. I hope it wasn't as gloomy as people predicted. I think that actually I'm pretty positive about a lot of things. I would also say, when I return to migration, the kind of demographic dividend of the trends in Africa may well be a potential thing we need to think about. But the one thing we really do need to do, I would submit, is we need to make sure that everybody in our country has a set of skills, because we are going to become a high skills economy over the next while. And that, I think, is not just about high skills for those people who are coming through as younger people in the education system. I would submit that there is the ability to upskill at all ages. And I don't think, and this is now, I move from facts, which is what I've given you the time to view, if I may just give a personal view, we can show demonstrations of how you can upskill after the age of 50, and I think there are enormous opportunities to do that and to put more effort into it. Thank you very much.
Hi. I'm just going to do a couple of questions that have come up on the board. And one of the things you talked about was growing number of women ageing without children. Just wondered if sort of you've done similar analysis around men and whether you think the issues are likely to be the same.
They will be to a very great extent, and particularly if Stuart's work builds up over time. But of course, still at the moment, it is longevity amongst women over men, which is really still an important factor there. So yes is the simple answer. But the one we really looked at was women, for the very simple reason that when you get to the over 85s, that differential becomes greater.
Great. And we started off with this question of how pessimistic you are. When sort of 25, and we all are, you know, 25 years ago, would you have imagined the world the way it is now? And then thinking forward, you know, what we've got a panel at the end of 25-year-olds. What can they look forward to? You know, how confident are we? I suppose. How confident were we, and how confident will we be?
Yeah, no. I'm massively confident. Honestly, I really am. But I think you made some important points, because one of the points that I didn't say, but it's pretty obvious from everything that's been said, is that an aging population is not solely driven by increasing longevity. An aging population is driven over a long period of time but by what's happening with childbearing. And I say that because, you know, when I was a junior academic working on population issues was, if you like, when we started to see below replacement childbearing in this country. Wonderful academics like Kath Keenan were saying, well, you know, all the evidence is that people are saying they're going to have children, they're just delaying. And then for a large cohort, that delay didn't quite happen for the first time. It just didn't happen. And I, along with others, in kind of when you're sitting in beautiful chairs like this, have over the last 30 years said, I suspect we will return to something like replacement childbearing, you know, not perhaps to the kind of 1965-like levels, but back up. And a couple of times we've got back up to, you know, 1.9 children per woman, and I've gone, yes, told you. And then next year it comes zipping down again. So I do think there are really interesting questions about childbearing and about the incentives for people to be able to childbear, which people still report that they want to, but at the same time to have, you know, commensurate occupations with skills that they've gained and everything like that. And so I'm not in the business now of predicting the next 25 years, but maybe I'll just say what I've been doing for the long time. It's going to get bigger, but perhaps not ever get back. Now, if that doesn't happen, then you're in a position where over the long term, if you don't have migration, your population is going to decline. And there was a piece that there's a fabulous statistical journalist called John Byrne Murdoch who works for the Financial Times. And he had a graph in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, which I completely agreed with. And he was arguing that Korea was the place, South Korea, where reductions, where they could half the population by the end of the century, I think was his numbers. Now, do I believe that's going to happen? Perhaps not, but it's not, you know, impossible. And we need to be thinking, I think, about our relationship between migration and childbearing and the incentives to childbear.
Great. A brilliant point to stop. So thank you for joining us today. Thanks. For those of you, we're going to keep the questions you've asked, because I think some of the questions you've asked are relevant for later sessions. I loved the stat around the economic contribution of 50-year-olds. Some of you will have seen that Joe Lycett recently threatened to burn £10,000 if David Beckham didn't pull out of Qatar, and then decided not to on the argument the cost of living crisis, it would be irresponsible. And of course Twitter is great. Someone worked out that actually it would actually benefit the economy more if he burnt it, because they worked out how much it cost to print £10,000 worth of money. And the happiness stuff is great. One of the great debates around is Michael Marmot versus Richard Layard in this debate around actually how relevant happiness is to quality of life, with Michael Marmot arguing that Richard Layard is way overestimating the value, because if you look at places like Japan where people are very rich but very miserable, versus America where people are very happy but actually not, you see significant inequalities. There's some very interesting findings. At that point I'm going to stop for a break, and we'll be back in sort of 10 minutes or so. So grab a coffee. Thanks.